See Malaki. He's sitting in the grass. He's sitting there in the grass like a good boy. Yes, he is. You're a good boy, huh? Anyways, I think that's where it needs to be. All right. So it's the same day as where I left off on the last video. Now it is 11:30. Okay. Just reposition, move back to that same shaded area that I've shown you before. So again, there's a road up there, so you'll probably see people passing by on occasion. It's been about half an hour, 40 minutes since I last cut, and I've been using the time to try to figure out how I'm going to share, how I'm going to proceed forward and share this story about my time spent in Las Vegas with Dan. And I feel like the easiest way to go about doing this is first I'm going to tell you all about Dan, about who he is, as far as everything that I learned about him during this time I spent at his house, like face to face. I'm just going to tell you about his life background according to what he shared with me. That way you know about him, and then I'm going to talk about different things that happened while we were together. So I feel like that'd probably be the most effective way to proceed forward from here. So just keep in mind, as I'm telling you about him as a person and an individual that I spent time around getting to know, everything I'm sharing with you might not necessarily be in chronological order, but it is something that happened during this time frame. I'm going to try and do it in chronological order, but things might be out of sequence, and that's totally okay. So when him and I returned to his house, I mentioned in the last segment, that's when I was pulled into his world, where him and I were together, where he had me within his influence to try and manipulate my perspective of reality to the best of his abilities by filling my head with all kinds of stuff. When I met Dan, so pretty much everything that I'm sharing, this is all knowledge and information I learned after my DMT experience. Remember, before my DMT experience, I had only been at his house for about 15 to 20 minutes before I blasted off, before I smoked the DMT. So I didn't really learn much about him during that time frame. There's just a lot of weird energy going on at that time. So I wouldn't learn anything about him until I had agreed to stay at his house that night, which I ended up staying at his place for 2 or 3 nights, and then I continued on to Arizona. So his defenses came down as far as being hostile towards me, and from that point forward, he was trying to illustrate himself as a friend, okay? But when we first started talking, Dan told me that he was a spiritual assassin. When he told me that, I didn't really know what he meant. What does that even mean? And so when he further elaborated, he told me that he has the ability, the gift of speech, to speak to people or someone in such a way that he can bring them down, like make them feel so bad about themselves, make them feel so guilty about themselves or their life, that he has the ability to defeat someone's own mind and provoke them to commit suicide. He can manipulate somebody to kill themselves. That's how he described his ability. He was a spiritual assassin. And he had a tattoo. He has a tattoo that goes along his collarbone, like just like this, and it says, "Only one of us walks away." On his left or right knee, he has a tattoo of like these hooded, it's like these entities, and they're all wearing these black hoods, and they have like, I don't know if they're like skeleton faces or just black faces with like red eyes or something, but they're each, all four of them are different methods that him and his dark forces can use to kill somebody or kill themselves. There's one entity that can provoke somebody to, kill themselves or to go murder somebody, or I don't know. I can't really remember what all of the figures represented, but it was like four different ways of death, four different types of death. So that was tattooed on his leg, and he proudly shared that to me. And another time around all this time, when he told me that he was a spiritual assassin and what he could do, I remember him saying that by him and I spending time together, that he was going to go in my head. He's saying that we spend time together, I'm going to go in your head, just you need to know this. And I was like, I said, yeah, I understood that. We spend time together. I'm going to be thinking about things we've talked about. So I guess, you would be in my head. But I also said the same thing back. I was like, pretty sure I was like, it's a two-way street. So it's like, if you're going to be in my head, I'm going to be in your head. So I didn't really make much out of him saying that, where him saying that he's going to be in my head, not really appreciating the significance of that, like where he could literally be in my head and have the ability to look through my eyes, like through remote vision, and hear my thoughts. Like that's what he meant by being in my head, as far as I'm concerned, but I didn't really get that at the time. Okay, so just like those are pretty deep things for him to say, and it's like, by him saying that, I'm sure at the same time he's probably reading my body language, seeing how I will respond, and of course I just don't flinch. I'm just talking with him. And later on, he told me a little bit more about who he is, and he said he was the king of Las Vegas. That he said like he owned Las Vegas. Like if you just think about Las Vegas as a city, he said he owns the city. Like he's the top, like the king of Sin City. Okay, he says that, and I don't really say one thing or the other. I just acknowledge it. Okay. I don't know if he's just, his ego's so big and he just perceives himself as like some alpha dog that's like the top guy in Las Vegas area where people just don't fuck with him, or does he actually own the city? I didn't know if he was being literal or just blowing smoke, trying to make himself appear bigger than he is. Speaking of bigger than he is, as far as his physical attributes, Dan, he had a beard, bald head. He had a piercing, a piercing on his, I think it was his left eyebrow. So he had a ring, like a hooped ring in his left eyebrow. Only about 5 foot. He was between 5'5" and 5'8" as far as his height. 5 feet tall, 5 feet 5 inches tall, between that and 5 feet 8 inches tall. He wasn't a very tall person, a tall guy. As far as his weight, he was a healthy weight for his height. As far as how I perceived him, he's pretty good muscle tone. He wasn't fat or skinny or anything. He was a shorter guy and seemed like someone that you really wouldn't want to fuck with. He carried a handgun. He had a handgun. He might have carried two handguns. At his house, he usually kept his handgun like on his couch on like this little center console that opens up that has you can put like it has a little storage in it, so you can lift that up, and he would keep his handgun at least one handgun there, and I think he had other handguns hidden around his house. Let's see. As far as his past, he told me in his as far as his upbringing, Dan told me that he was an abused child, when he was little, that I don't know if it was his real father or his stepfather, but he abused Dan, beat him, as far as what Dan shared with me, for whatever reasons. And he said that his mom called him the devil, called him that as a child, said he was the devil. And for whatever reason that his father abused him, Dan only took that abuse for a certain amount of time before he started fighting back. However, I don't remember his exact age, but he said at some point in his life, after being abused by his father, he started fighting back, in the sense that he would get in fights with children his age, and he wanted to see what he was capable of. So he would just get in fights with people. He would instigate the fight and just get in fights with people just to see what he was capable of. And then as he got more experience with fighting, he was starting to fight people who were older than him. And then he and then he was getting older too. So then he was just like this, like a shitty, like a teenager with a really bad attitude. And he would get in fights with, like, probably people younger than him, people his age, teenagers that are older than him, and then he would fight adults too. He told me stories about, he'd get in a fight with someone his age or a few years older, and then at some point, whoever he had just beaten the shit out of, their parents would find out, that kid's parents would find out, and then he said at some point their parents would come find him to intervene with what had happened, and he would beat the shit out of the parents, like their father, like the father of the kid that he just beat up. He was telling me all this. At some point I asked him how many fights he had been in his lifetime, and he said over 1,000. He'd been in over 1,000 fights in his life. He told me one story about beating the shit out of some guy. It was either near Dan's own vehicle or at the guy's vehicle, and then Dan told me about smashing the guy's skull with the door, between the door and the frame of the car, smashing his head in. And he said the guy survived, and then later on, like years down the road, he crossed paths with that same guy, and his head was like indented, and he had a scar. And I don't know, they interacted again. I don't know that he spoke with that guy again, and the guy was like really scared of him. And then apparently Dan, he grew up around Los Angeles. As far as what he told me, he grew up in Los Angeles area, and he told me that he joined the Hells Angels at some point. He didn't really go into detail about how long he was with the Hells Angels, or if he was still a member of the Hells Angels or whatever. He just mentioned that he belonged to the Hells Angels when he was in Los Angeles, but beyond that I have no knowledge. For all I know, he was still Hells Angels, a fallen angel. It makes sense. Because he's telling me all this stuff, but I also know who he is as far as spiritually. I know who he is beyond his flesh. What I'm telling you is how he's lived his current life. I think he was around 50 years old at this time. And so he was telling me how he's lived his 50 years. And so he belonged with the Hells Angels, so you can only imagine all the crazy shit that he's been part of and probably bad things that he's done. He told me about his hatred for law enforcement. He hates police. And then I think it's that point when he was telling me about his hatred for police. I think I told him about my grandpa being chief of police in Redmond. You know, I was like, my grandpa was chief of police for like 30 years where I grew up. And then he started laughing. He started laughing when I told him that. And then I told him like I was a cadet. Like I worked as a cadet for 3 summers with the Redmond Police Department. And he laughed at that. I don't remember where it went from there. But he was aware of my family background as far as my grandpa being chief of police. I think I told him that my uncle, so my father's brother and my grandpa's son. I told you my grandpa and grandma, they had 3 children. So and my father, and he has an older brother and a younger sister. So I have an aunt and uncle between that line of my family, between the Durgan family. And my uncle worked as an Oregon State Trooper as his career, and he retired as he worked a full career with the OSP, Oregon State Police, and he retired. So my family background is law enforcement. But I don't know what my dad, as far as my dad, I don't know what the fuck his situation is. And then also my grandpa and my uncle, they were both veterans. They both served in the Navy. So if you don't remember, I'm just bringing that up. So that I believe I told Dan that information, and he laughed at that. Okay, so proceeding forward with Dan's background, he told me, because he lived such a violent life, he was abused as a child, and then he became a bully once he decided to step up for himself, stop allowing his father to abuse him. He essentially became a bully, and that just escalated into something way worse, where he was just beating people up for no reason, instigating fights for no reason. Anybody that looks at him wrong or makes a joke about him that offends him, he just gets in a fight for no reason. These are just fights that he's told me about. And then I'm in the back of my mind, I'm wondering, like, well, have you murdered anybody? How many people have you killed? I didn't ask that question because that would be self-incriminating as far as that in that aspect. But I mean, if he's been willing to do all these bad things to people as far as creating physical harm and violence, I imagine there's been some fatalities that he's been directly involved with, innocent people getting murdered, and then rivals getting murdered, people that he perceives as a threat to whatever he's doing, getting murdered, either by him or accomplices of him, people that are tied to his web. Then he told me, he kind of gave me all this violent background, but he never told me if he left the Hells Angels or if he was still affiliated with them, but he no longer rides motorcycles. I don't know how that works as far as club rules. But as far as I'm concerned, that I just had an understanding that he came from a very violent background. Then Dan said, I think it was around, he said it was when he was between the age of like 30 or 33. It was between those ages. He said that someone tried killing him once. He said he was driving in his vehicle, and he was going through an intersection, and he got T-boned by somebody. He said it was a woman that T-boned him, and it broke his back. Like, Dan's back was broken as a product of this car accident. And then because of that, I don't know if he wasn't paralyzed, but he was pretty much crippled to where he wasn't able to walk for a very long period of time. And he was married. I think he was married at the time this accident happened to this woman named Jamie, who I had met when we got back to his house. And I'll tell you more about her in a little bit. But I'm just telling you about Dan at this moment. So he got in this wreck, and his back was broken, and he was pretty much bedridden for a period of time. And ran out of time. But what I was saying is like, he got someone hit him in the car, so he gets in a wreck. His back's broken and he's pretty much bedridden for a period of time. Okay, I don't know where the last video cut off, so I'm just repeating that sentence. And so he has his wife Jamie, and I don't think that they'd probably only been married between a year and 3 years when this accident happened. And she took care of him until, while he was injured, until he was able to start walking around. They were still together, but I'm just talking about this accident. So she took care of him while he was dealing with this. I don't remember how long he said he was like, immobilized and incapacitated to where he was like his back was fucked up. But he said when during that period of his life where his back was broken and he couldn't really move around, he at some point put on a bunch of weight. I think he became like, I think he said like around 300 pounds. And so at that time, he was eventually able to start walking around again, but he was in pain. But when he became really big, I guess he had a really bad attitude. He was a very dangerous, angry person, especially after his back was broken. Because he perceived it as somebody trying to kill him, and explained to me how it may have all been set up. Because he told me that right before the accident, I think he said it was his employer that called him on the phone and was asking where he was. And so he told him where he was at, and then his employer was asking like exactly where he was. And I think Dan said he was like weirded out by that. And then right after the phone call, he proceeded forward in this intersection and then got T-boned. So he explained that to me, and he told me how bitter he was. I can't remember if he said that. I don't know what happened to that lady. I don't know if he ended up retaliating and they went after her. If it was a setup and Dan didn't die, obviously. Whoever that lady was, if she was trying to kill him, I don't know what happened to her. I don't know if she got put in protective custody, so that Dan couldn't get to her, or if Dan and his minions ended up finding that woman and she probably got murdered for it. Tortured and then murdered. Raped, tortured, and murdered, any combination of that. But Dan said that, after that accident, or after that attempted murder, he became really angry, and then so that attitude and him being a bully just escalated while he was on pain pill. I guess I think he became addicted to pain pills as a product, from his surgeries and all and everything that was involved with the wreck. So he became addicted to pain pills for a while, which made him put on all that weight. So he became very overweight, especially for his height. He showed me pictures of what he supposedly looked like at that time in his life. Like he was pretty fat. And then I don't know if Jamie was in this. She might have been in the same position. She might have been. I think she was overweight too. But then at some point, I think Dan decided that he wanted to not be overweight anymore. I don't know what motivated him to change the direction of his physical abilities or disabilities because of his accident. But what I'm saying is, at some point, he started exercising and fixed his diet. Like, I guess him and his wife, they really changed their diet as far as the type of food that they eat. And, like, they became very conscientious of the types of food that they eat. And then I think he started exercising more. Long story short, he lost all of that weight, and now he's like a healthy weight. And he uses that story as far as him being overweight, and now that he's a healthy weight, he carries this picture around with him. He uses that story to initiate conversations with strangers. And I'm going to further elaborate on this, but what I've just shared with you is a story that he tells all people. Any opportunity he gets, he tells these stories to people. Like, he loves talking about himself and the things that, all the things that he's been through and done. Like, any single person that he crosses paths with out in the real world, if they'll stand there and listen to him talk, he tells everybody the exact same story, like it's a script. And what I just shared with you, that's a story. I for my own position, I heard him tell that story like 4 or 5 times to four or five different people. And I didn't even, I hadn't even spent that much time around him. But every person he was meeting, he was telling the same story of different types of different things. It was always the same thing he talked about, and he had it memorized down. Not just the words, but his emotions and how he moved, like he was acting. But when he decided to lose all of his weight, he still kept getting, and I guess him and his wife, or it might have just been him, I don't know if they were both addicted to painkillers or whatever prescriptions that they were getting that Dan was getting from the doctor for his surgeries and all that. I don't know if his wife Jamie was also taking them or if she was on other shit. She might not have been. I'm not saying she is, or I'm not saying she isn't, but Dan said at some point, like, he had become addicted to the pain pills and the prescriptions and stuff, and then he decided to just, I think he said he quit cold turkey, just stopped taking them. And then, but he continued taking the prescriptions as long as he could, and then he was selling all of the pills that he was getting from the doctor. And he told me about telling me about all the money that he made by selling these prescriptions. So that's probably a crime. I don't think you're supposed to do that. But he told me that's what he did, and that would explain how he's able to finance a lot of expensive things down the road. At some point, again, I'm just telling you about him. I'm not necessarily talking about everything in chronological order over this period of 2 months. I'm just trying to tell you about him, everything that I learned about him during this time frame. I think it was the first weekend that I was there, that when I did my first DMT ride, I said I was there for like 3 or 4 days. It wasn't until like the third morning. It was like the third day that morning. So after my second night of sleeping at his property, like I was just sleeping in my van each night. I wasn't sleeping in his house. But the third day there, and that morning, I met up with him and his wife at a coffee shop that they regularly went to, like almost every single day. It was part of their routine. They would go to this coffee shop, get coffee, and then that's when both of them would just like either read books or they would be on social media researching stuff or on Instagram sharing stuff. They usually kept busy on their phones, and they used that coffee shop as a place where they kind of just were out in public, letting their presence be known. And that day, that morning, when I went there to have coffee with them, eventually they arrived there before me. I think I went and took Malaki for a walk, and then I met up with them after I was done taking him for a walk. So when I get there, I walk in the coffee shop and I sit down across the table from Dan. So it's just a small little table, and Dan and I are sitting across from each other, which is when we start talking. As we're talking, and we're looking each other in the eyes as we're talking, at some point, I'm looking Dan in the eyes, and I notice something strange about his pupils. Kind of weird. So, I notice it first, so I start looking a little more intently. And then at some point, I'm just direct with Dan, and I ask him, I'm like, Dan, there's something different about your eyes. And he nods. And I was like, they kind of look like they're like vertical. And he nods. And I was like, can I look closer? And he's like, sure. So him and I, like, he leans forward and I lean forward. So we're like this far, face to face from each other. And we're just staring at each other directly in the eyes. Or directly staring at each other in the eyes from that close. And I'm looking at, and I kid you not, Dan's pupils, not the irises, but the pupils, the blacks of his eyes, they were vertical, like a fucking cat eye or a snake eye. And it was very distinct. And I'm like, holy shit. In my head, I'm thinking that, like, holy shit. He's not fucking human. Um, he's something else. I don't say that out loud, but I acknowledge. I say it though. I was like, Dan, your eyes are vertical. They're like slits, and he's like, yep. And then that's when, we lean back, and so that's when he starts talking about it. And he told me that his eyes have been like that since birth. And he told me as he was getting old, as he was growing up, he eventually had somebody come in his life who he just called a friend. But his friend told him that he needs to always wear sunglasses, or he needs to always like smoke weed to make his pupils expand a little bit more. Smoking weed or something that can make his pupils expand a little bit more, so they're not as as tightly vertical. Or he just needs to outright wear sunglasses so people can't see his eyes. But the people that have been his friends as he's grown up, who he's the company that has surrounded him, they've known who he is, and they've all acknowledged his eyes. And so as Dan has reached age of 50, he's always kind of had to be conscientious of this and not allow certain people within proximity of him without having some type of something covering his eyes so that they can't see, so that I guess good people or neutral people can't see his pupils for what they are, and then pick up on him being something that's not human. So this is something he mentioned. He didn't, as far as being told as a youth that he either needs to always smoke weed or he has to wear sunglasses all the time, just to remain anonymous in this world. So that's something, right? And that was something for me to think about, and I've never forgotten that. His eyes being vertical like that. My buddy, good boy. Milaki's been laying in the grass right there. He's a sleepy doggy. Oh, okay, good. I wasn't sure if ran out of my timer because the clock. All right. That clock wasn't counting down. I wasn't sure if I had passed my time. I saw it 7 minutes left, so it wasn't a big deal. But sometimes I get caught up in the story and I forget how long I've been speaking. But after I learned about seeing, observing Dan's eyes and him acknowledging it, it wasn't just me seeing it and thinking I'm seeing something that I'm not. No, I mentioned it to him, and he acknowledged it and confirmed it and told me a little bit about it, as far as growing up with his eyes being that way. That's one instance of noticing that, and then there was I'm just gonna, since we're talking about the subject of eyes, there was another day, I think it was like the first time I watched Dan do DMT. When he did DMT, his eyes turned full black, like the whites of his eyes, his irises, and his pupils, the whole eye turned black while he was under the influence of DMT. Excuse me. And this happened right in front of me as I was watching him, and his wife Jamie was watching him. She actually was recording him with her phone, because I think Dan wanted her to, but she was recording him with his phone while he was on DMT, because Dan wanted to watch it when he came back to reality, right? So Jamie and I saw his eyes turn black, and we saw this dark energy coming into him and emitting out of him while he was under the influence. And we were like, I think we both looked at each other like, oh shit, like what the fuck? Or at least I was. I mean, her and I made eye contact, like we were both kind of uncomfortable. Okay, so, and then fast forward a little bit. I'm going to tell you more about his DMT experience in a little while, but I'm talking about his eyes since we're on the subject. So his eyes turned black while he was on DMT, full black. And then eventually once he came back to reality and had a little bit of time to calm down and get himself, just up on his feet again, acting like his normal self. At some point, I think his wife gave him his phone, and he watched the video. Like, he was just sitting on the couch watching the video. So he from her phone, he could see, he saw when his eyes turned black, and he showed me the video. And then he told me, he told me that nobody's allowed to know that. He's like, nobody's ever allowed to know that this happened. He's like, people can't know that his eyes can do that, turn fully black. And, you know, it's one thing about his eyes being vertical slits, but another thing where his eyes turn full black, and then he's telling me that nobody can know about it. And I'm just like, whoa, that's gnarly. And since we're continuing on this subject, that was the only time I ever saw his eyes turn black, right? And then I'm gonna shift gears real quick, and I'm gonna bring up my dad, Jerry Durgan. I'm just gonna fast forward, and I'm gonna elaborate on this later once we get to that part of the story. So don't worry about it. But I'm just gonna mention something. When I returned from Las Vegas, 2 months later or whatever, when I make it back to Oregon, my dad and I ended up getting in a pretty heated argument. And that night, after returning from Vegas, I saw his eyes turn fully black, just like Dan's. I've seen my dad's eyes turn full black, including the whites of his eyes. I've seen it probably, I think, 3 times, but maybe just twice. For sure twice, maybe 3 times. I've seen it with my own eyes while I'm sober. Well, I've seen it when my dad's eyes have turned black. It's been when he's really drunk, when he's had a lot to drink. And that's when something always takes over, and it's no longer my dad speaking, it's something else that it's like he becomes possessed. When my dad gets really drunk, there is something that can possess him. I've seen it. So my dad's eyes have turned completely black, and the third person whose eyes I've seen turn completely black is the other individual who I've not yet named. If you're aware of my backstory and why I got arrested in 2019, you know who I'm talking about. But if you don't know who I'm talking about, there is a third individual who I've seen her eyes turn completely black. And that individual is the one that I was fighting against when I got arrested. So there's that. So that's why I keep saying I've named 3 individuals. Well, these 3 individuals, all 3 of them, I've seen their eyes change. So as far as everybody else who I've met, whether good guys, bad guys, neutral people, out of everybody I've met in my lifetime, those are the only 3 people who I've seen whose eyes have turned completely black. And that's why I'm saying, as far as law enforcement, military, FBI, CIA, NSA, as far as that anybody in those occupations, that's why I've said start with those 3 and work your way out, because out of everybody I've met, those are for sure people who are plugged into the evilness and darkness in this world. They have an ability to do, do they have magic powers? I don't know what they're capable of. I just know that they're either possessed by some dark demons, and those demons are giving them powers, or these 3 individuals are, they're demons or fallen angels or forsaken in disguise as humans. Whatever it is, I don't have these official answers, and I understand it can sound fucking ludicrous or crazy to be saying this on camera, but I'm just saying this is what happened. This is what has happened. These are things I have experienced and observed and witnessed, and all of it. And imagine, back up to 2019. Imagine being in my shoes, encountering these people, and trying to survive without being ensnared by their traps. Just imagine trying to walk this path that I have. Not only exposing them and learning how they operate, but also like trying to tell people. Imagine, people that are just going about their lives who have not necessarily discovered any of this knowledge or things about the world that I have, and haven't been on their own like I have since I quit Costco. And I've seen and experienced all these different things where other people have just, they've just been working and living their lives, and then all of a sudden I come out of nowhere and I'm saying all this stuff, trying to get people to pay attention to it, and people don't have any idea what I'm talking about because they don't know my backstory, they don't know what's happened to me, they don't know where I've been and all this. And then when they hear what I'm saying, yeah, it can really sound like I've lost my fucking mind. It really can, and I understand why people might think that when I'm sharing things with them, and that's why I don't get offended when people don't necessarily believe me. That's why I keep saying, you guys just need to, I just need to be able to tell my story and tell you how all these things have progressed as I've been going. And by hearing my story, eventually you'll find out the truth, and you'll learn how I attained certain knowledge and certain beliefs and everything every step of the way. Because eventually, depending on who you are and what your experiences are, you might be surrounded by someone who is the same type of demon, fallen angel, or whatever darkness they're secretly harnessing. You might have them around you in your own life. And if that's the case, you need to be aware you have enemies around you, and you need to protect yourself. You need to separate yourself, or you need to deal with them. Whatever that even means. Confront them and scare them away. Scare them with the truth. Tell them you know the truth about them, and tell them to get lost. But be prepared to defend yourself at the same time. And this is what I've been dealing with as far as good guys versus bad guys. Who are the bad guys? Well, as far as I'm concerned, they might appear as a human being. They look just like a person, but who's on the inside? Who's the spirit operating the person? Is it, you hear things about demons, you hear things about the fallen ones, the fallen angels, the forsaken. You've heard about reptilians. Whatever combination of that, I don't know if all of those are each their own thing or if they're all the same thing. They might all just be the same thing, just with different names. But once you realize that they're out there and they're hiding in plain sight, and you can see them if you're paying attention, if you know what to look for. And a big indicator, not all of them, but a big indicator is the pupils of their pupils, their eyes. When I was in jail, when I got transported to Humboldt County, and eventually started working in the kitchen, when I became part of the kitchen crew, when I first got moved into that quad, where my bed, I got, like, whatever job you have within the working dorm, there's a unit where all the inmates in that unit, they're just workers, and they have different job assignments. And whatever your job assignment is, whoever else is part of that crew, your bed is in the same unit as all of those inmates. You don't have people with different jobs sleeping amongst each other. Everybody with the same type of job, you sleep in that area together and everybody has their own bed. So when I got moved into with the kitchen crew, there was one guy that was part of my quad. There's 4 beds in my little unit. There's 2 single beds, and then there's 2 bunk beds. So my unit could hold 6 people. And one of the guys in my unit, he literally had a fork. Not only was his eyes vertical pupils, like he had vertical slits just like Dan, but this guy, he had a forked tongue. Like his tongue was literally forked like a fucking snake. And he could wiggle his tongue like this. And it wasn't a cosmetic surgery that he had. He was born that way. He was born with a forked tongue. And he had vertical pupils. And I sat at a dinner table with this guy and talked with him while I was making these observations, because I'm in jail. It's not like I get to choose who I'm working with and all this stuff. I have no say-so. It's like I'm just there, and whoever is around me, I just have to be respectful, and they'll be respectful, and then nobody fights, and we just do our time. But there's that guy. He had a forked tongue and vertical pupils. Crazy shit. eventually he got shipped off to prison. He did some pretty bad crimes, and so he only worked as far as when I joined the kitchen crew. He was only there for maybe a few weeks to a month, and then he ended up getting shipped off to, I think, San Quentin or somewhere around there. But he had some pretty big charges on him, so he might even still be locked up right now. I don't know. Yeah, I've just been talking about people's eyes. These different people that I've met along the way that are directly involved with this. Just talking about eyes. That way, once this video's over, and now that you're aware of it, just pay closer attention to your company. Yeah. What else is there to share about Dan? So I guess Dan belonged to some organization called the Lion's Den. How I mentioned that he told me that he's the king of Las Vegas, like he owns Las Vegas. It's words out of his mouth. Okay. So further elaborating on that, Dan told me that he belonged to this club called the Lion's Den. And apparently what the Lion's Den is, all the head people of different types of businesses, organizations, government departments, you got law enforcement, like Las Vegas Police Department. So all these people that are within the top positions, casinos, all this stuff. So CEOs, chief administrators, this type of thing. These people that are running all of these organizations. Apparently, I don't know if it's like a weekly thing or once a month, but they would have meetings at a designated location, and their club was called the Lion's Den. And all of these head people would come together, and they would have meetings, and they would talk about different types of things that are occurring, and they would come up with a plan on how they wanted to proceed forward with whatever agenda that they have. Whatever issue is currently on the table, everybody would discuss ideas, and they would come up with some type of plan or solution to maneuver things in their favor. And Dan said that he had the absolute say-so in what was discussed. Some people would come up with good ideas, and they would use those ideas, but sometimes people would come up with ideas, and people want to go with that idea, but Dan might not like it, and his say-so would override everybody's. If he did not like an idea, something would not happen. He had the final say-so, according to Dan. Okay. And amongst this group of people, there was, I think he said it was like one of the lieutenants with Las Vegas Police Department was included in this circle. So somebody within Las Vegas Police Department who was a high rank had secretly pledged himself to Dan. He never told me how many law enforcement were involved, but he did mention somebody within Las Vegas Police Department who was pretty high up there in the rankings. And mentioning that, mentioning the law enforcement, someone within law enforcement being involved with this, I'll connect that piece at a later time because things happened for about 6 months after leaving, 4 to 6 months after leaving Las Vegas and eventually going to Montana. Somebody that I met in Las Vegas got murdered, and I learned that it was a product of Dan and the Las Vegas Police Department working together to carry out a hit, like an assassination. And I will fill you in on all of that, but I'm just hinting at this thing about Dan having connections with Las Vegas Police Department. And if he had connections with Las Vegas Police Department where there's somebody that had secretly sold out, I don't know if all of Las Vegas Police Department is. I'm not condemning all of the officers who work in Las Vegas. I'm saying there's at least one who is connected to Dan's circle, and so that person takes orders, and the things that happen within Las Vegas Police Department, strings are being pulled by an outside party. That's what I'm saying. And so if that's occurring in Las Vegas, my question is, where else is it occurring around the country? And if it's also occurring around the other country, or if it's also occurring around the country, has it already happened in Central Oregon, right? Are there people within Central Oregon law enforcement, whether it's local police, county, state, FBI, any of those organizations? How many people within those agencies have secretly pledged allegiance to something where all the rest of the officers have no knowledge of it, and all these other officers are just trying to do their jobs, and they have a rat or a mole within? That's what I'm getting at. That's why I've said, you can't condemn all law enforcement when you just have one bad apple out of the bunch, or there's just a few bad apples out of the bunch. It's okay, just get the bad apples out, and then get everybody else, just get them up to speed. Everybody learns their lessons. We learn from our mistakes, and we don't do those things anymore. We keep our eyes out for anybody, speaking about the future, we keep our eyes out for anybody that might be deviating down this bad path and lying. Especially if you're in law enforcement, like anybody who becomes a police officer or an agent, like, you take an oath. You take an oath to do your job as you're supposed to, and not become a criminal. You don't, you become an officer. You take on that occupation because you want to catch criminals and catch bad guys and keep your local community safe. You don't become an officer to become a criminal. Like, how does that make sense? And so that's what I'm really getting at, and that's kind of how things kind of evolved later down the road, where I started appearing hostile towards law enforcement, is because I did not know how many officers had pledged allegiance to Dan, and they were secretly operating on some dark agenda. So that was one of the big things that I was kind of getting at on social media when I was speaking against law enforcement. I was just speaking about those bad apples, and those bad apples who are making all the rest of law enforcement look bad. They're making everybody. It's all about creating division, where you have the bad apples within law enforcement that do bad things, and then they get caught, and then the general public becomes aware of it, and then overall the general public just, as a consensus, hates or strongly dislikes law enforcement as a whole. So you have good law enforcement, good male and female police officers who have done their jobs as honestly and with as much integrity and ethics as possible, only to have the public view them as the bad guys because of some bad apples who ruined the law enforcement's image, and everything's just escalating from there, and it has been, which is why we have this, everybody hears about this thing called the police state, and it's all just a product, the police state, and this massive rampant ramp up of violence between law enforcement and just the general population. It's all being orchestrated and organized by people that are pledged to Dan secretly. Wherever they're at in the world, they have all come together at some point in time. Everybody's pledged together, and they're pulling the strings behind everybody's backs. And the whole point is to create division amongst the general population and those who are within law enforcement and the military and FBI, to make war amongst each other so that nobody is looking behind at who's pulling the strings. And what I'm trying to do is just to disarm both sides, in the sense of, okay, guys, slow down for a moment. I'm going to do everything I can to show you the bad guys, the real bad guys. Even though both sides have all these messed up issues, we're going to put that to the side for now, and we just say, okay, you stop fighting with law enforcement, and you stop fighting with the general population. Now that I have both of your guys' attention, look at the strings that are connected to you guys and see who's pulling them. You guys think you're, say you have law enforcement here. You all might think you're all on the same team and you're all fighting these guys, but you're not looking at each other, and you're not seeing that some of your brothers and sisters may have sold out without your knowledge. And as you guys are fighting this, they are communicating with agents within the general population, and these people behind are provoking the general population to fight law enforcement. And so there's agents within both sides that are communicating with each other, which causes things to escalate and fights and riots and wars and everything to just blow up as a product of everything being controlled from the outside. All these puppet strings being operated from the outside. I hope all of this makes sense, right? So that's what Dan has been connected to while he was in Las Vegas. He told me about the Lion's Den and the things that they do when they would have their meetings. And, when not only would they just have their meetings and talk about all this stuff, they would have, like women, I guess they would be involved in sex trafficking and human trafficking. So when they'd have these big parties, they would always have women, attractive women show up, and the women would be handing out products and, things that they're selling, things to keep all the guests entertained and stuff. So you have all these attractive women walking around and then flirting with the men that are there, probably sleeping with them. Just this whole big mishmash of people who have sold out, and then you got women that are involved with sex trafficking, or women that have sold their souls so they can make a lot of money while they're entertaining guests, kind of like a prostitute or a hooker. Whatever it is just this disgusting thing that he was telling me about. He would call them 420 girls. They were called 420 girls. That's how they were referred to as, I believe. Which was pretty messed up. All that stuff was pretty messed up. Let's see, what else? I haven't talked about his wife yet. I'll talk about her, specifically about his wife, Jamie. Give her own moment in the spotlight to let you guys know about her situation. I'm just trying to think about other things about Dan's background that I can share with you guys. I'm sure I'll have more pop up later. Let's see. What time is it? 12. I almost feel like stopping right now to take a break, and then I'll just continue forward later. My throat's pretty sore, and I kind of need to review some of my footage and get my thoughts reorganized, so that way I know what I've covered and what I still need to get into. I still know everything I need to get into, but I'm just trying to make sure I'm covering all of these important details before we move on to the next stage. But anyways, yeah, I'll continue in a little bit. If this ends up being the end of the video, have a good day or a good evening wherever you're at. Rainbow. Following day. Next morning. Waking up to that, man. It's pretty cool. Huh? Rainbow. This is the day after I shared my last video. It's the next morning. It's always a good sign. It's pretty sweet. Humalaki. Out walking the dog. Out walking Mr. Dog, and there's a rainbow. That's so cool.